Sup? Today you will know. Conflict in the USA, the true story of the Civil War in 1861. The bloodiest war in the history of the United States began. The enemy did not come from outside. It was a civil war between the northern and southern states. Why did more than 600,000 people die? What did the Southerners want? And what did Lincoln want? What consequences did this war have for the history of the country? About all this in this video. Causes and reasons for the conflict. Every school child in the USA knows that slavery was the main and only cause of the Civil War in the USA. And immediately we come face to face with the main myth because this conflict had several causes, some of which were not directly related to slavery. When the USA was formed in the late 18th century during the war with England, the states entered into a series of treaties, including the Constitution. This was done to ensure that the states would be a unified mechanism in the fight against a common enemy. Soon, differences began to arise between the states in terms of governance, economy, the formation of economic institutions, etc. These issues became especially acute when the U.S. government in the first half of the 19th century began to pursue protectionist policies. Industrial goods from England were heavily taxed, forcing Southerners to buy goods from the northern states. At the same time, they were prohibited from raising prices on agricultural products. And if we add to this the increase in taxes for the southern states, we get a high level of social tension. One crucial issue for the South was slavery. These lands were agricultural, with huge fertile plantations where African slaves had been used since the 17th century. As the American historian de Tocqueville wrote, slavery becomes fatal to the master. For the North, the Southern economic model had no prospects. In order for the USA to exist as a unified country with a modern economy, it was necessary to abolish slavery. This was not so much about humanism, but rather about the country's economy. The Republican Party, led by Lincoln, advocated for the united integration of the states and the abolition of slavery. When Lincoln's victory in the presidential election was announced at the end of 1860, the southern states protested. They then decided, exercising their right to secession, to leave the United States and form their own country in February 1861. The southern states declared the creation of the Confederacy. With Jefferson Davis as its president, this constituted 40% of the country's territory. To maintain the United States, it was necessary to show strength. Lincoln began preparing for war with the South. Interestingly, the events in the U.S. were followed by journalist Karl Marx. As early as 1861, he wrote an article noting an important fact for historians today. It was the South, not the North, that initiated the war. At the end of the article, he makes an important conclusion. Slavery, the root of the whole conflict, would serve as the source of continuous hostility, disagreement, and struggle, making the situation that unfolded in 1861 inevitable. Major events during the war. More than 2 million soldiers were mobilized in the Army of the North, and more than 1 million in the Army of the South. Bombing of Fort Sumter April 12th to 14th. 1861, the beginning of an armed conflict between the southern states and the United States. Government. Fort Sumter was located in Charleston, South Carolina, and was run by the United States troops. Confederates representing the southern states took up arms against federal troops. As a result of the bombing, federal troops surrendered the fort, which marked the beginning of the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, is one of the most significant battles of the Civil War. The battle took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. United States troops, commanded by General George Middleton Middle, engaged the Confederate army of General Robert E. Lee. After 3 days of bloody fighting, the United States was victorious. allowing them to push the Confederacy back to the southern states. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st. 1863, President Abraham Lincoln announced the emancipation of all slaves in the states under Confederate control. The proclamation freed about 3 million African Americans, which strengthened the anti-slavery movement in the United States and undermined the economic foundation of the Confederacy. The Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, the battle that took place in Maryland was one of the bloodiest events of the Civil War. United States troops, commanded by General George McClellan, clashed with a Confederate army led by General Robert E. Lee. The battle claimed hundreds of thousands of casualties, but the Confederates were unable to achieve victory and were pushed back south. Was captured by the United States, symbolizing the defeat of the South. The fall of Richmond came after a long siege and fighting that left the Confederacy unable to defend their capital. General Lee's surrender, April 9, 1865. General Robert Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, signed the Act of Surrender, effectively ending the Civil War. The surrender took place at Appomattox, Virginia, and marked the beginning of the end of the Confederacy and the return of the United States to a single state. Consequences of the war. It is noteworthy that Lincoln did not see the surrender of the South. In April 1865, he was mortally wounded by one of the supporters of the Southerners. So, the emergence of political terrorism is one of the consequences of the American Civil War. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Slavery was prohibited. Despite this move, the plight of blacks remained dire. Many states introduced segregation laws, even in the second half of the 20th century. Blacks will continue to fight for their rights, in particular for the right to education. A prime example is the work of Martin Luther King. In the second half of the 19th century, the black population of the United States began not only to vote in elections for the first time, but also to be elected to government bodies. To modernize the economy of the slave states, the Reconstruction of the South was announced. To prevent former slave owners from causing problems, members of the Confederate Army were prohibited from holding public office. After the Reconstruction of the South, agricultural management was modernized there. Factories began to appear. Some veterans of the South could not accept defeat. Among these was Nathaniel Forrest, who founded the Ku Klux Klan in late 1865. This organization has become a symbol of violence and racism in the United States. They unleashed terror not only against the black population, but also against the Republicans. More than 600,000 died in the Civil War. Some will say that this is the price that the Americans paid for the abolition of slavery, others for the preservation of the unity of the country. One thing is clear: in the form in which the United States existed before 1861, they would not have lasted long. The difference in political and economic systems gave rise to many conflicts, and slavery became the core of these disputes, a phenomenon alien to freedom and democracy, something with which it was impossible to build a modern state with a market economy.